Hi, we continue in Luke 16 today with the story of the rich man and Lazarus as they both find themselves dead but in different places. And I would just note that in this story, which Jesus does not call a parable in any way, it just takes for granted that dead people can talk and have conversations and these things can go on. So there's a complicated picture of the eschatological outcome of death in Luke's story, and we won't look at all of it. We've already looked at Gehenna back in chapter 12 when it came up there, and we looked briefly at Hades in chapter 10 when it came up there. So I'll refer you back to those things if you'd like to know more about the background of either Hades or Gehenna. But here we're going to look at it in connection with part of the vision from the first book of Enoch, which you may not be familiar with because it's not in the Bible, but it certainly was greatly influential on Luke and in much of the New Testament, and was a result of composite editing over the time from roughly Alexander the Great in the 3rd century BCE till roughly the late 1st century CE, the time of the Gospels. And nobody knew at the time what books were going to make it into something called the Bible eventually, so First Enoch was certainly understood as a sacred text for many people, including the Gospel writers. And in it we'll see some of the scenario that Luke takes for granted here. Because one of the interesting things about Luke's Gospel, and really all the New Testament, it makes assumptions on things that are not in the Septuagint that expects people to understand, like the existence of the devil or someone called Satan. Satan is in the Septuagint, but not the devil. And so there are a number of aspects that have to come from somewhere, and First Enoch is one of those sources. So as we've been looking at, we're looking at how this story fits into the larger picture of Luke 15:1 to 17:10. I won't go through all that again. There's an introduction of the entire unit and also an introduction to chapter 16 that covers some of it. But we're in this down here. And this is the final parable, even though it's not called a parable, it plainly is. It's not obviously being named as if it's a realistic event that happens sometime. And it's showing the consequences of the rich who refuse to listen. And they're played by the Pharisees in this story, at whose house a meal is still going on that began back in chapter 14 with the tax collectors and the sinners listening along with the disciples. So as we've been seeing, the whole chapter fits a kind of thematic chiasm with the Pharisees being named as lovers of money or silver lovers and ridiculing Jesus at the center of it. And so as we saw, this parable here is not only parable to the story of the manager of injustice, but is closely parable to the story of the father and the two sons. Not only in these ways that I went over last time, but with a number of verbal links that we'll see as we go today. So they're not thematic so much as this, but other ways that Luke is expecting his audience to compare and contrast the story of the father and the two sons and the story here of Abraham, the rich man, and Lazarus. And all of this, as I was noting, is an illustration of what Doug Oakman referred to as the deep meaning of mammon as wealth that's collected. So not just wealth itself, but wealth that's collected in the face of others who don't have any. And as I've been going through, I'll continue to go through annotating the story with Jesus or the narrator's own words back at the rich man here. So we ended up here, and here we are in our story right now when he calls out to Father Abraham. So let's begin with our story right over here, and we start with Hades. And so we saw it earlier, used for Hebrew Gehenna, the temporary abode after death, where he was being tormented. So we don't know who's doing the torment, we don't know what form it takes. And the word for torment here is only here and a little later in the chapter, and only one other time in the New Testament. But it fits the scene that we see in two passages from 1 Enoch. Scholars often point to 1 Enoch 22 as what we see here, which is Enoch's request to the explaining angel about why the separation. So this is about the chasm that we'll see in just a moment here, and we'll see in verse 26. But earlier is the issue of the abyss, or the separation as chasm. This is not using in the Greek chasma, the same word, but it's presenting the same image here. And so as we see, in those days they shall be led up to the abyss of fire, into the torment and the prison, in which they shall be confined forever. And whoever shall be condemned to destroyed will from thenceforth be bound together with him to the end of all generations. And I'll skip down here. Destroy all wrong from the face of the earth, and let every evil work come to an end, and let the plant of righteousness and truth appear, and it shall prove a blessing. The works of righteousness and truth shall be planted in truth and joy forever. But later we hear this description as a temporary place. Why is one separated from the other? And he says, these three have been made that the spirits of the dead might be separated, And such has been made for sinners when they die and are buried in the earth, and judgment has not been executed on them in their lifetime. Here their spirits shall be set apart in this great pain till the great day of judgment and punishment and torment of those who curse forever, and retribution for their spirits. And that's consistent with what we see in Daniel 12, where we hear those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to a resurrection of good things and some to a resurrection of judgment. But that sense of an interim period. But in the Daniel vision, they're asleep. And in the Enoch vision, they're not asleep. And plainly in Luke's vision, they're not asleep, but are experiencing this active torment. So various speculations about what happens, and of course we don't know. And Jesus is not presenting this in response to a question of what happens when we die, but what the effect is of rich people refusing to share with those in need, and the consequences they face. So we can't really mine this for a description of something that will happen, and we have to see it within the parabolic context here of what Luke's doing, and what Jesus is doing in that. So let's leave this up as we look at our details. So he looked up and saw Abraham far away, much like the father in the story of the father and the two sons looked up and saw the prodigal far away. Literally, he lifted up his eyes and saw a Septuagintism we see all the time. And it's interesting that he sees Abraham. He doesn't see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is a common refrain. He doesn't see God directly. He doesn't see angels. He doesn't see anybody else with him. He just sees Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. And I like this image, although it's anonymous and undated, and I don't know where it's from. I like the fuzzy nature of it, and I like the sense that it's looking across this chasm far away to a place of great greenness. And in Enoch, the place for the good people is a place of beauty and earthly joy. So it's not a disembodied place like some might picture a soul going to, but a place of earthly delight. So he looks up, and sees Lazarus not at his side, but in his bosoms. And I noted that last time that he was here in verse 22 was at his bosom, and here it is again. Why the new RSV is so hesitant to name the body part of Abraham? You could simply say chest, and that would be good enough. So I hope they're just not embarrassed about the old-fashioned word bosom. But it plainly is the place of honor, whether at a banquet, as we see in John 13:23, or in general, as we see in John 1:18, when the Word made flesh is in the bosom of God. And so here he is in the bosom of Abraham. And what is going to happen here? As Herzog notes, the rich man's request is delivered with two imperatives. He is still an elite, accustomed to issuing orders and having them obeyed. And he might cry out, "I'm sorry, forgive me, I repent," in the flames, and realize how wrong I was, but no, he has learned nothing. And that is part of the point of the overall parable, as we'll see. So he called out, "Father Abraham." And that's where my note over here says from John the Baptist, "Do not begin to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father, for I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham." And so what he's expressing is the very presumption that John was arguing against there when people from the countryside and from Jerusalem came out to him, and he said, "Who warned you to flee from the wrath to come?" Well, this rich man's been warned to flee from the wrath to come, but he hasn't fled from it. He's gone right into the face of it. And so he calls him Father Abraham, and he calls for, "Have mercy on me." Notice this is all in the imperative. Father Abraham, have mercy on me. And we haven't seen mercy before, but we'll see it coming up. As Bailey notes, the well-known cry of the beggar, but now he has become one. And here's how he expects the mercy to be embodied. Send Lazarus. And the irony of this is multiple levels. First of all, he knows his name. He knows the name of the poor person whom the dogs have been licking right at his gate all this time when he's been feasting sumptuously every day. How does he know his name? We don't know. But he's paid enough attention to know his name, and he's still completely ignored him. And perhaps that's why he's the only named character in any of the parables, so we can illustrate that Abraham knows who he is and yet has cared nothing for him. The word for sending here, pempo, in the verb form, we've seen a couple of other times, but mostly for the sending out of the disciples, and here for the centurion, recognizing authority that he could send somebody and they're sent. But we also had it back in 15:15 as one of the echoes of the story of the father and the two sons. So the prodigal was sent to the fields to take care of the pigs. So he says to Lazarus, or he says to Abraham, "Have Lazarus dip the tip of his finger." Bopsy, the word for dip, from which baptism is only here in Luke, interestingly, and it's in John 13 around the foot washing story. It's also in Revelation. Neither of those have to do with baptism. Dip the tip of his finger, and scholars wonder whether this is a purity code question, where he's still concerned that Lazarus is unclean and he only wants a minimal amount of Lazarus to touch him, or whether it's the minimum possible request to just get a drop of water on the tip of his finger, but we don't hear. So dip the tip of his finger in water and presumably bring it to him. We've seen water a few times. And cool my tongue. A lot of things we could look at there. Is it only his tongue that's hot? And note, if we think of this as something that most Christians think of as what happens when you die is you'd go to hell in your soul, you wouldn't have a tongue and you wouldn't feel heat. One of the great paradoxes of people who picture hell as a place of flames is to wonder how your soul is experiencing agony in flames, which presumably can only affect bodies. But the word for cool here is only here in the New Testament, but there's a wonderful ironic use, and it's one use in the Septuagint here, where Abraham says to the visitors, "Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree." So the great irony that the rich man wants Abraham to send Lazarus to do what Abraham himself did for his divine guest that he doesn't know was divine. And tongue here also, we saw tongue only one other time in Luke, back here in 64, when Zechariah's tongue was freed and he began to speak praising God. And one could wonder whether this person could speak praise to God, but there's no mention of God and no concern for it at all, just concern for his own interest, as has been the case all along. For I am in agony in these flames, as if it wasn't obvious. The word for agony, though, adonomai here, is used earlier in Luke for anxiety, the parents' anxiety they couldn't find the young Jesus, in Acts 20 for grieving, and not elsewhere in the New Testament. It is 11 times in the Septuagint, but it can mean grieving or anxiety in different contexts. This certainly doesn't suggest grieving here in the flames, although he certainly could be grieving that he didn't get it sooner, and agony seems like the right word. And the flames, as you can see, the word phlox, from which we get the flower named phlox, and from this image, only one other time in Luke Acts, and it's a reference to the burning bush in Stephen's speech, and we see in Revelation eyes like a flame there. And Herzog notes he never asks why he's in the flames. There's no sense that he's being judged. He's just finding himself in this difficult situation, and he wants someone to send the fire department to cool it. And he assumes that Lazarus is working for Abraham as the fire department, but he's so wrong. And Abraham responds, child, using teknon here, the gender-neutral term. As Herzog notes, he's still a child of Abraham, but a child in need of repentance. And it echoes the woman bent over who was a daughter of Abraham, and what we'll see with Zacchaeus as the son of Abraham in 19:9. And then he says, remember. And that's, of course, key, but the time to remember was earlier. We saw earlier in chapter 1, again, the reference is Zechariah back there, the remembering happily, a celebration of God remembering, remembrance of God's mercy, as we saw back there. But it's too late for the rich man to remember, for it to make a difference. So remember that during your lifetime, entazoe here, which is my note below, has not mere chronology, but while the rich man had the most precious gift of all, zoe, and it's 3 times with aeonion for eternal life. You received your good things. And it's yet another link to the story of the Father and the 2 sons. Although the verb for receive is a regularly everyday word, apolambano, it's only a couple of times earlier in Luke, once in the Sermon on the Plain, and yet here, as the Father received the prodigal. So in that story, as the Father received the prodigal back, the rich man received good things in his lifetime, but he's not in his lifetime anymore. And as we saw here, echoed, woe to you who are rich, you have received your consolation. And Lazarus in like manner evil things, and similarly, blessed are you when people exclude you, rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven. So Lazarus excluded by being left on the doorstep of the rich man, and it's named affirmatively as received evil things. One could say he did not receive good things, but instead he received evil things, the denial of hospitality as an evil thing. But now he is comforted here, and that's, of course, part of the Sermon on the Plain reversal as well. Using parakaleo, yet another word echoed from the story of the Father and the 2 sons, when he began to plead with him, when the Father came out and began to plead with the elder son. And now it's Abraham who's comforting Lazarus, the prodigal son, parallel here, while you are in agony. And then finally for today, one more verse. And scholar Christian links this with Genesis 17:14 to be caught off in the circumcision and covenant situation. And given the echo of chapter 18, that's not too far off, although this obviously isn't about circumcision as such. And it's not even about membership in the family of Abraham based on a ritual. So although it's close to the same narrative context as Genesis 18, it doesn't seem thematically like it's directly connected. But Abraham continues, beside all this, and as Adewale, writing from an African perspective, notes the variant epipositotis as because of all these things. And he's writing from a perspective that sees rich pastors and other rich people in Africa ignoring many poor people there. So it's because of all these things, not just beside all these things. Because of this, here's this chasm between you and us. And the you is plural here, indicating although we don't see anybody around the rich man, he's not alone. And there's a great irony there, because in his lifetime, with all his wealth and his glorious meals, we didn't see him with anybody else. So between here, Mataku here, we saw it one other time previously. You and us is a great chasm, a chasma, only here in the New Testament, only one time in the Septuagint, and that's where the pit in which Absalom's buried. But as Marshall notes, the imagery is likely from 1st Enoch, and we saw that already. So it's been fixed, sterizo, for something set in place. Just as Jesus set his face in 951 to go to Jerusalem, so this chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so. Notice might want to pass, using diabenai to cross over, and it's repeated again on the other side of the verse. It doesn't say whether they do want to pass, but even if they want to, they can't do it. Is that showing a God who's harsh? Is this a God who refuses to provide forgiveness? Well, chapter 17, beginning of it, that ends our unit, is going to be Jesus telling them, forgive, forgive, forgive. But there does come a point where it's too late. And that's the eschatological judgment scenes we see in texts like Daniel and at 1st Enoch and the apocalyptic literature that highlights that God cannot be just if the wealthy who act unjustly get away with it in their lifetime. There must be some judgment after life where it's too late to say, I didn't know. And we'll see that in the closing scene, that he should have known. So there's a chasm you can't go, and no one can cross from there to here, so you can't get away. So we'll reach the third part of it here as we see in response to the chasm. We heard you begin to stand outside and knock at the door, saying, Lord, open to us. Then in reply he will say to you, I do not know where you come from. So what is the rich man going to do now? Well, he still has a plan, but his plan is not showing he still doesn't get it. We'll see his final result of his plan next time. See you then.